All right. Welcome. My name is Nathan Wisnowski. I am an infrastructure architect at Concurrency, and you are in Service Manager 101. Wait, no, not 101. This is Service Manager Performance and Scale. If you're looking for 101, this content is not going to exist here. This is going to be very deep, rich content regarding performance and scale in Service Manager. We're going to take a deep dive into how Service Manager works, how you should scale it, and also lots of tips and tricks from the field. We have a lot of content to get through. We also have some pretty cool demos. I would ask that if you have questions, let's hold them to the end. Also, you can tweet them, and we'll start to answer those questions at the end as well. I've been working with Service Manager for about 4 years. And whenever we talk about performance and scale, I want to set the stage by talking about what are we performing for. The customers I'm working with are looking to see really one of three things from a Service Manager implementation. They're looking to see visibility in their organizations, process improvement, or automation. And really, at the end of the day, it's you're an IT department that's employed by the business because you deliver something that's useful to them. It helps the business make money. It helps them be more efficient. It helps them do their processes to be able to get their job done. There's something you're giving them or delivering to them that's important to them. So we're either trying to understand it better by having visibility into the work processes that go into delivering that service or its configuration, or you're trying to improve your process for delivering that service, or you're trying to automate that service or that process that you're delivering to your customers. And we've seen that in very practical implementations ranging from hundreds of thousands of objects in the CMDB, hundreds of thousands of computers in the CMDB, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of servers, millions of instances of work, and 400,000 plus assets. So lots of content in the CMDB, lots of work happening in Service Manager, lots of automations happening that are delivering a lot of value to our business. You can see up there a couple examples where we're saving on a per automation basis an hour of time. Multiply that times hundreds of thousands of automations, and in large business scenarios, you're seeing a lot of things delivered. In small business scenarios or medium business scenarios, you're getting the same things, just a matter of scale, right? So when we're delivering these things, we need them to perform well. So what does performance mean? Performance means really four principal things to me. It means when I'm in a console, it shouldn't take 4 seconds plus another 4 seconds for me to be able to start working on my incidents. I should be able to click incident, and it opens up in, say, sub 3 seconds, my people can start putting incidents in. I also should have quick read operations. So when a person is in the console accessing data, that should return data very quickly for them. Because when someone calls them on the help desk, that needs to return data quickly so they can say, oh, thank you, Mr. Wisnowski, for calling the help desk. How can I help you today? And you're walking through your troubleshooting scenario. If you're waiting 5 seconds for that form to open, it's really artificial. Also, we want our portal performance to be really great because that's where we're interacting with our end users. If the portal performance stinks, they're going to call us. So we need to have a very well-performing portal. We want to have no or minimal please waits on the portal. I've seen plenty of those today at MMS. Also, we want to have our submissions from the portal complete without failure. When someone submits something, it should submit cleanly, and it should go into the request items. Also, automations. When our automations execute, do they take 1 minute or 5 minutes? I'm going to show you how very easy changes in your performance configuration will alter how quickly your automations execute. Also, report performance. Now, report performance is to a certain extent about setting expectations. It's saying, look, if you run a report against every object in the CMDB and you relate it to all the incidents, it's going to take a second to run. But I want to set those expectations, or I want to do some pre-delivery of those reports so they get them at particular times. Very large organizations, what we've done is we've delivered our reports through the SharePoint web interface, and we've had them run against snapshots. So they're delivered on a recurring basis very quickly for the users who go to access them. What does scale mean? Well, not everybody here has even tens of thousands of systems, right? So I think those performance aspects relate to everybody. What does scale mean? A lot of large companies are looking to leverage Service Manager and Orchestrator for their operations. My customers have had in excess of 200,000 users, in excess of 20,000 servers, geographically dispersed topologies, meaning we've got users in Europe, we've got users in Asia, we've got users in the United States. We need it all to perform well. How do we do that? And also, we have so many requests. How do we execute on all those requests quickly? So we're going to talk about scale, but just because I mentioned scale doesn't mean it doesn't apply to a smaller business as well. All right, what are we going to cover in our agenda? We're going to be going through, first, the architecture of what a large deployment looks like, so that way you can take that and bring that into your own business. Also, SQL Server configuration tips. We're going to be busting out the individual little tips that we can do in SQL. User experience optimization, meaning console operations, portal operations, workflow and connectors, how can we make them actually perform well, and also our data warehouse. Awesome. So let's go into our deployment architecture. What are my general assumptions for a large organization using Service Manager? Well, A, they're going to be geographically dispersed. Might just be in one country, but it's probably around the world. We want constant availability. So if I take down an aspect of this tool, it needs to work. That's really important. As people start throwing all their processes in Service Manager, if the thing doesn't perform, that's going to be a real problem. And if it's down, you're going to wreck a lot of the automations that you're building and people are depending on. Failover scenarios need to work. And also offloading. One of the key messages I want to give to you in this session is segment your deployments in reusable parts that are smaller rather than throwing everything into one box. And you'll see why that's beneficial. And we've seen that very practically as we've been deploying in large organizations. Also, generic scale being large scales over 50,000 users. That's kind of what I'm describing as a large scale deployment. Millions of work items a year, et cetera. All right. Now, I'm not going to walk through each individual number here, but I want to give you a little idea of what are the units of scale in each of these, and what do we need to be worried about? What are they bound to? What I've found in scale is that our management servers tend to be CPU driven. Okay? So if I go from 8 gigabyte of RAM to 16 gigabyte of RAM, or 16 to 32, it tends not to affect very much, but I do tend to be able to utilize my CPUs. So when you're looking at your management server performance, it tends to be more CPU bound than it is RAM bound. It also doesn't tend to have a lot of impact on disk, so that can sit on a kind of generic disk set that you happen to have. SQL servers, on the other hand, the most critical aspect of performance is disk. If your disk performance stinks, everything in System Center is going to stink. So I'm going to show you how to get that disk performance metric. RAM is sort of our next aspect of scale in SQL servers. So RAM is basically taking the load off your disk, right? So if you want your SQL Server to perform well, and you have sort of moderate disk loaded up with RAM, that costs a lot less than having a consultant come in, right? So load up the performance with RAM and a high-performance disk on your SQL side, and I guarantee you see great performance on the console side. Data warehouse servers are very similar. They're extremely disk-driven, but analysis services specifically is very RAM-driven. The key thing you'll see here is that SQL servers tend not to max out a standard physical 2-socket, 6-core with hyper-threading box. Usually it's sitting around 2% CPU utilization while the disk is going crazy. So that's something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. Disk is much more important than your cores are. Same kind of story with the SQL servers for data warehouse. And then when you're coming to the SharePoint servers, you'll find that your cores and your RAM are kind of equally important there because there's some caching that you can do. And then finally, the orchestrator management and runbook servers are also extremely disk-driven. We saw that very practically, that when we had orchestrator runbook servers sitting on very moderate disks, unlike kind of your large kind of 1 terabyte disk put in a big RAID 5 array, that performance was awful. But when we put it on our nice fast SSDs or onto our fast LUNs that we had available, our orchestrator runbooks were executing substantially faster. So that's something you should keep in mind as you're building out your management servers and also your runbook servers. All right, so what does this topology look like? Well, I realize that this is a little bit small, so I'm going to kind of dive into it here. You can see in my topology that I have green, kind of pinkish, and then blue, or orange. Now, what you have here is kind of three critical elements. You'll notice that I've broken out my connection servers from my management servers and my orchestrator target server. Okay? That was a big mistake that we noticed, is that if we didn't break out our orchestrator target server from our management server and our connection servers, our automations were sharing the same servers that our users were connecting to, and then we experienced sort of inconsistent performance due to the collections of users accessing different things. So in a large-scale deployment, make sure that you break out your server roles. First off, the management server, that's that first server in the farm anyway, right? You don't want to have consoles ever attaching to that. Second, your connection servers are handling somewhere between 30 and 60 on average users, so you need a load balance across your content switches to access that. And then finally, you can see, as it's called, SMORC target server here, the goal of that is to have servers that my orchestrator servers specifically are talking to versus having orchestrator servers which are shared with the connection servers. So keep that in mind as you're building it out. Also note, when you see my SM portal and SharePoint WCS, right here, that's the breakout of the actual SharePoint farm itself and the content servers. Remember, the users are getting content from both the content server and the SharePoint server. So you need to be making sure that that's redundant in addition to the SharePoint farm. Most of the larger companies we're working with, they have a SharePoint farm we're deploying into. So we're deploying the web parts, but the content server we're offloading somewhere else. Also, you can see the data warehouse server obviously has to be its own. It won't even let you install in the same place. But we're using a dedicated SQL data warehouse as opposed to putting it on our operational data warehouse environment. Sometimes people are even splitting off analysis services to be able to get that performance. I'm not expecting you to be able to see all the individual performance characteristics. You can jump into that later. The slide deck will be available. Finally, I want to show you a little bit about how we organize Orchestrator. Orchestrator, you'll notice I have two different Orchestrator environments. Why is that? Well, Orchestrator can scale up pretty well. Right? You can throw a lot of runbooks. And in our case, it's throwing hundreds of thousands of active runbooks running at it at a time. Right? So, well, not continually, but very high scalability. But what you'll notice is that achieving scalability in that space is very difficult. So what we did is we broke out our orchestrator servers based upon what they're doing. So in this particular case, you can see that I have an orchestrator management server that links to runbook servers. So I have a segmented management server that then goes and executes these runbooks at different places. But I also have an orchestrator server whose job it is to run some of my incident management processes or my initiation processes. Now, those can action on different management environments and not have any impact on each other. So what you can see from this is that by segmenting these different servers into different pods, I'm able to scale without having to have crazy high resources on one particular box. It gives me a lot of redundancy and allows for me to be able to execute in a modular way. Also, you can see that I have double SQL servers. I'm using always on as a protection mechanism with Service Pack 1. That provides a great failover capability, especially since SQL really is the linchpin upon which everything runs. I welcome you to jump into this and check it out a little later as well. All right. So a couple aspects of SQL Server configuration. Now, whether you're the SQL admin or you work with the SQL admin, I think these will be very helpful for you. Now, something that not a lot of people know about SQL Server is that TempDB, especially from the standpoint of Service Manager, is probably the most important element of scale. And most people have it misconfigured because it gets installed by default on the C drive of wherever your SQL Server is or the installation drive is. So people have these SQL servers and they're attached to disk, but it's never actually executing those data in the TempDBs on the right disk because it's sitting on the OS drive or the application drive, right? So it's very, very important to take those TempDBs and put them on your high IO spindles because all your work, all the aspects of modification to the SQL database are happening first there. If you were to maximize your performance of your TempDBs, you're going to experience drastically higher performance in your Service Manager environment. Also, note that you should have more than one TempDB. I'll show you how to do that in a second. In most environments, one TempDB is not enough to be able to sustain performance in a high disk scenario environment. Also note that you need to test the performance of your actual database itself. Right here I have a command that you can use to be able to test your SQL performance using an application called SQL.io. Who's heard of SQL.io before? Okay, portion of you. Okay, cool. So this is one example of running SQL.io. There's a lot of really deep SQL performance experts out there. This will give you a good benchmark, and I'll show you a little example of what that looks like. Also note that your RAM allocation should be 2 GB less than what your maximum RAM on your server is. If you let it use defaults in SQL, it'll eat up all the RAM, it'll starve the OS, and even though you may have 16 GB of RAM in your SQL server, it'll start to perform very poorly because normal operations that should never go to page file are going to page file because SQL's robbed the OS of all of its RAM. So very important. Most SQL servers are configured improperly in that respect. SQL Broker. Who knows what the SQL Broker is? Okay, cool. So SQL Broker's job is to manage the work that's occurring against the SQL server. Now, if you do not have SQL Broker enabled, you're experiencing a drastically poor performance of workflows in Service Manager. Ironically, most environments that have SQL Broker disabled are those that have specific SQL teams that manage the SQL servers, because most cluster implementations don't have SQL Broker enabled by default. Whereas people who nexted their way through their SQL install likely have SQL Broker already enabled. So check your SQL Broker by executing that against your Service Manager instance, and then change your SQL Broker settings if it's not enabled by first stop the Service Manager service, by the way, because it's going to put it in a single instance mode, and then switch it to on and then enable again. I guarantee you'll see faster performance. So I see that in maybe 1 out of every 4 implementations on clusters that I haven't built myself and we're kind of looking at. That's something that people say, oh, my workflows are performing really poorly. That's a really good example of where you can check that. Max degree of parallelism. Max degree of parallelism is really interesting. By default, SQL will basically use all of its cores to be able to execute every job, right? That's kind of bad in some instances because if you're a generic end user who's using an advanced view type and you go and return 200,000 workstations, you're robbing everybody else of performance, right? So sometimes changing your max degree of parallelism setting from 0 to 1 or 4 provides you a much better performance scenario. So usually we're seeing 1 or 4 provides us better performance when we have lots of console users because it's saying you can have these 4 virtual CPUs, you can have these 4, and allows us to segment how things are running. So you can check that by running that command, max degree of parallelism, and it's very easy to change. I'll also include a link on how to kind of understand it a little bit more. Your mileage may vary there, so it's not like a kind of standard thing that you set it to one or the other. Also, validate read committed snapshot isolation is enabled. By default, when Service Manager is deployed, RCSI is installed by default, but I've seen a lot of instances where that's been changed. If read committed snapshot isolation is not enabled, your performance will be substantially worse. So that's something that you definitely want to check. And I'll show you a little example of that too. All right, a couple other examples. Making sure that your RAM usage is set properly. How you know it's not set properly is if your available megabytes of your page file is below 100 megabytes. That basically means that your page file is being super consumed and you're having your available megabytes on your system are being super consumed and everything's going to the page file and your normal operations on your system are going to page file and going to disk rather than using it in memory. Also check your disk I/O. Very easy to test. Either determine, really your gold standard is looking at your average disk read and write performance based upon it being less than 20 milliseconds on average. You're going to see some spikes, right? Big operations, they're going to spike. But you shouldn't see it consistently over that. Also, you can take a look at your disk queue length. If your disk queue length is spiking above, say, 2 on a consistent basis, for example, I'll go into some implementations, I'm seeing their disk queues hanging out like 50 or 100. And I'm like, where you got this thing sitting? It's like, oh, it's on my, my shared array of disks. Like, that's kind of your problem, right? The disk is basically not keeping up with what Service Manager is requiring it to do. Also, of course, validate your CPU performance, although I'll say it's almost never CPU performance. And then check your groom settings. So some organizations need to keep a lot of content in the CMDB for a long time. Other companies, not a big priority. The smaller your operational database is, the better off you'll be from a performance standpoint because SQL will be better at keeping all that data in memory versus having to go to disk for it. So if you can, keep your groom settings smaller and so groom every 90 days or every 45 days or whatever, if you don't have as much capability to be able to assign crazy resources to it. Check your log size and expansion. Logs in Service Manager should be set to simple. If they're not set to simple, you've got a problem. Because most of the time, you're going to have log expansion that you don't want. So set your logs to simple, make sure you have a backup plan, and make sure they can expand if they need to. I've seen some implementations where expansion on the logs was disabled, and then all of a sudden we started having crazy issues, right? Because the log couldn't continue to write, therefore it couldn't write to the database. So you got to make sure that your SQL people don't try to constrain your databases, or if they are, that they have some kind of alert that's indicating that your operations are getting close to the maximum size. And then also, SQL Always On is now supported with Service Pack 1. If you're building to scale, you probably need high availability SQL, and you're probably looking for geographically dispersed high availability SQL. So that's something that you can take a quick look at. It does a really good job of walking through how to configure it. All right, let's check our SQL settings. All right, so these are going to be relatively basic to start, but I just want to show you really quickly where you're going to run these things. So if you have your SQL Server and you've got SQL Management Studio, take the little commands that I put into the PowerPoint, and you can execute those straight away. Okay? So for example, in this particular case, I'm checking whether or not my broker is enabled on my server, tied to the database of Service Manager, execute, turns is broker enabled, 1 is good, 0 is bad. Next item. All right. Max degree of parallelism. Max degree of parallelism in this case is 0. That could be bad if you have a lot of things happening, right? So it's a good example of something that you should probably change if you have a lot of console users. Another example is whether or not read committed snapshot isolation is on. Likely it's on. Definitely check it. If it's not on, you're going to have some performance problems. All right. This one we'll come back to. All right. I also want to show you how to add temp DBs because this is a pretty important thing. So you can see that under your system databases, you have your temp DB, and your temp DB contains files. Now, you're going to almost always have one log file tied to your temp DB, but you can notice that you can add additional temp DBs to the temp DB itself. Notice that the default location is C: program files because I installed SQL to C, right? But in most cases, your actual database LUN is different than the LUN on which you've installed your server, right? Because your temp DB might be your 2 internal physical drives that are sitting there. So when you add it, certainly go ahead and change it. Very easy to add additional temp DBs. I usually just call them the same. But note that you need to make this equal in size because it's going to basically spread the I/O across the temp DBs. Very useful, right? Because it allows for us to be able to leverage a lot more capacity from an I/O standpoint than we had before. Last thing I want to show you on our SQL side is SQL I/O. This is an example run that I ran through SQL I/O for 30 seconds. You can note that this has 10,000 IOPS per second, capable of writing about 631 meg per second. It's pretty awesome, right? That is the 2 internal SSDs on this laptop. So I would be really interested to know if your super expensive, awesome SAN is performing better than my laptop that's got 2 SSDs and costs maybe $3,000. So that's something to check when you get home, right? Is how does your SAN perform? Very easy to run, just copy, paste. You can set the location basically by just changing the location of testfile.dat. If you use the -C option, then, or /D option, then you can set it to use a particular disk and it'll generate the file for you. That's probably your most useful thing in your entire career. Maybe not entire career, but very useful, right? It's just understanding what is the performance characteristics of my disk. All right. User experience optimization. A couple aspects of this that are important. First, use self-service for low training interactions. Your typical users, you should be able to deliver them a self-service experience that performs well for them to do their things you don't want to train them on, right? The general idea is that if I have a common IT operation like deploying an application, I should be able to hire a guy off the street, bring him in, and he can use my self-service portal to deploy an application. Should be dumb easy, right? Also, when we have IT users, console performance is very important. Console performance should be, when you open an incident, you should be able to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Incidents should be open. Totally usable. If it's not, your system's not performing properly and you need to fix it. If it's 1, 2, 3, you have an awesome system and you're in really good shape. If it's longer than 5, you got to start looking at it. Your console will perform great in under 100 milliseconds of network latency. 150 to 200 is about 40% degradation. You're going to start to experience some problems. So how do you get content to those people who are geographically dispersed? Well, there's really 3 options that we've seen have been successful. Option 1 is use remote app, running on a VDI session, and deliver that to the users. That works pretty well, right? It's console experience running through remote app. It's fine. I've found that using products like GridPro or Cyerson stuff, the web UIs, are much better experiences for my web-based users who are using a console remotely around a geographically dispersed implementation. I have some customers where they're using, for example, GridPro, and they've got people over in Europe, they've got people over in Asia. They're accessing a service manager instance in the United States, and they're having a very good experience with it. So that's something I would consider is, in addition to remote app options, using one of these web consoles for those kinds of users. How do we optimize our console? A couple aspects of this. Weirdly enough, it has a slower performance profile when it's maximized. That's actually not Service Manager's fault. That's a problem with the framework in which the console was made. So when it's not maximized, you'll actually have a better performance experience. So if you were to drag it and make it almost the entire console, you'll have a much better performance experience. Also, make sure you apply the Service Pack 1 console memory leak fix. We've had a lot of projects where you got these guys there in an incident, open up incidents all day long, open, close, open, close, open, close. And it keeps eating more and more and more memory, and that's because there was a memory leak. So that was fixed in Service Pack 1. Make sure you apply that, and you'll see a much better console experience. Also, minimize the quantity of views. What does that mean? Some people have crazy numbers of views, and that can be okay, but each of those views has an aspect of load time when you construct the system. So either scale back the views for particular people or scale back your views in general. I prefer search versus actually using views. So when you use search, you're generally able to get that data back faster. You also prevent people from creating views which are problematic. So something very important to be aware of. Also, when making modifications to views, you're making a modification to a management pack, which performs a lot of locking. So you need to be aware that management pack changes really should happen from specific people, and they should happen especially during times of lower usage and during change windows. So if you deploy a new field to your database, that field might get added to hundreds of thousands, if not, or maybe even tens of thousands, whatever the size of your environment is. It's going to get applied to all those objects. So that's going to make a pretty significant performance impact. Also configure your global operators group, particularly in big environments. If you don't have your global operators group, I'd say even larger than 10,000 users, your global operators group is going to drastically change the way in which your picker works, right? So when you go to do assignments, if you have just your users that maybe it's 1,000 people on your help desk, in your global operators group, that's going to provide a drastic performance improvement when you're doing the picker. Also, use the most basic view type you possibly can. So if you're using basic views, you're returning data from only one class or slight collection of classes. If you're using combination classes, you're going to want to use the most specific combination class possible. So if your combination class is the advanced class, your performance is going to be terrible because the advanced class is like, give me everything in the database and return it to me all at once, and then I'll filter it. So I see that all over the place. So when people are having bad performance, it's because they use the advanced classes. So you need to be very aware that Travis put some effort into building type projections. You can also construct your own type projections. Be able to say, I want the incident and its relationship to the assigned to user. Bring back just that stuff, and your performance will be significantly different. So make sure that you're using the smallest type projection possible to be able to achieve the type of view that you want. Also, scoped versus unscoped user roles. Scoped roles should be leveraged only when necessary. Now, you can make them perform very well, but what you should know is that the scoped role relationship has an additional join when it returns data. So if you don't need to, don't use them. If you do need to, use it in specific instances where it makes sense. So that's something very important. It has a performance impact if your system doesn't have the necessary capability to deliver. Also, portals and icons. This is a kind of a big issue, right? So more icons simply means longer load time. What we've used is we put a start page in front of, because a lot of people like customized pages anyway, so we've made a start page that sits in front of the portal and then links to the request offerings, and that's drastically improved the performance experience for very large organizations that have many, many different request offerings and service offerings under different languages. It provides A, customization of the portal, B, an experience that directly matches what they're looking for it to do. So something to keep in mind there. Also, scope the request offerings based upon what they need and want. Use security to be able to say, look, everybody shouldn't be getting everything. Let's scope it to what's actually important to them. Finally, disable app pool recycling in SharePoint. One of the things that's already enabled in SharePoint by default is nightly recycling of your app pools for Service Manager in SharePoint. Make sure that's disabled, or you have a warm-up script. Also, make sure it's not set to recycle on high performance issues. I ran into that where a company's like, yeah, right in the middle of the day we have our portal starts to slow down. It's because they had an app pool that automatically recycled in the middle of the day when it hit a certain performance threshold. So take a look at that configuration. I have a link to how to check it. I think this is one of the coolest things that we figured out how to do. Use search in your query results. All right, so let's say you've got 3,000 users. No big deal, right? 3,000 users is the size of the query result in the portal. What if you want more than that? Well, the second you go above 3,000, you're either saying, I'm either going to increase my result set or I'm going to do some filtering. So the result set, what I'll say is never increase the query results. Pretty much bar none, right? Never increase the query results. The reason why is because when you go to that page and it's set to 3,000, you return 3,000 objects, you literally returned all 3,000 from the database, and then the portal is doing the filtering at that point. It's basically allowing you to search within the context of the return set. That's fine for medium-sized organizations, but if you've got hundreds of thousands of items, even tens of thousands of items, that's not the best way to deliver for your users. So I did a little blog on how to do filtering in request offerings, and I'll demo that and show you how to do it. Because in that particular instance, you're able to deliver even hundreds of thousands of users, computers, whatever, in less than a second. Pretty awesome stuff. Also, use previous questions to define filters. So when you go, or use set known information to define filters. When I go to the portal, I know who I am because I logged in with Active Directory. Use my information to filter what I can get. That gives me much more specific user experience and actually performs a ton better. Also, avoid using MP enum questions if you can, because they can't filter other things. So that's just something to keep in mind. All right, let's use pre-search filters. So I'm going to jump into, where am I going here? Right here, all right. So everybody knows kind of what the Service Manager, well, not everybody, but a lot of people know what the Service Manager interface looks like. So you can see here I'm asking 3 different questions, right? So I'm saying, what is the user's last name? What domain is the user in? Please select user disable. It's text, simple list, query. That combo is really useful. So in my domain the user's in, I have please select a domain, right? That's used inside the context of my query results. So you see here that I'm grabbing from the contains of the first question and then using the domain in the second question for the user or group domain. Does please select a domain match anybody's domain? No. So it fails instantly. Really useful when you have lots of stuff for it to query, right? So that's where I start. Using that kind of information, if you have big user sets, even just 5,000 users, right? Not super huge. And I say, I want to search for Lesnowski. Note that it returned nothing initially, right? So I say, okay, Dunk Lab, boom, there's my user. It'll perform that fast for literally almost any size, right? So in that particular instance, you could even use an advanced class potentially or a more complex class because you're returning 1 or 2 objects. You're not returning 3,000 objects. So I got a little blog on that, and that's really helpful to be able to take lots of objects and return them quickly, or even moderate numbers of objects and return them quickly. So take advantage of that capability. It's really useful. I can tell you that if we didn't have that, we would really struggle on certain types of requests. All right. How does our server topology look? Server topology always use a dedicated workflow server. Don't let your console users attach to the workflow server unless you've got maybe 200 people, right? Then, not a big deal. In this particular instance, if you've got a substantial set of users, the only server in your farm running workflows is your workflow server. Don't combine it with other stuff. Also use a targeted orchestrator server that the orchestrator environment will talk to. I kind of talked a little bit about that already in the topology. Here's where we get kind of technical. So if you don't know what these mean, that's totally fine. You can always go back and find the kind of blogs on these later on. In larger environments, first thing is implied permissions. What is implied permissions? Implied permissions basically means that if I'm a user of the system, I have access to my resources and my work items automatically through an implied permissions workflow that runs. If you don't disable that, that will automatically set those rules in the environment and people have access to their things. That makes tons of sense, right? It's a fine rule. If you've got lots of things, you either need to schedule it in some way or you need to set it so it doesn't run and use direct permissions. So there's different ways to use direct permissions that get around using the implied permissions workflow. In large environments, the implied permissions workflow can be very problematic. So you'll note that some of the examples here are going to be very centric to, like, say, 50,000 user plus types of worlds. But you can note that you might see this in your environment if you have lots of assets or lots of computers, and you can just know that it's there. Also, new priority calculation. Service Manager 2010 had a very basic priority calculation mechanism. It also had a very basic time resolution calculation mechanism. That was replaced with SLOs. If you don't disable this workflow, it's doing the set resolution time as well as the SLO. Usually we don't need that first one. So you can disable that, and it will have a beneficial impact on the performance of everything else in the system. Also, some companies don't need the work item set first assigned relationship rule. What that basically means is whoever is first assigned to the work item, there's a workflow that runs that actually goes and gets that information and makes a relationship between the user and the work item. Some companies, that's already set and assigned to a user, and it's in the history. So it's not necessarily useful to a good chunk of organizations. Also, SLOs. SLOs have a ridiculously heavy performance impact on the system because they run 4 different operations, and they have to run on a regular basis. So sometimes we've seen that SLO application can be relatively performance heavy, and it can have a negative impact on the system in general. So note that you shouldn't have 100 SLOs unless your system can keep up. And also we found that we can sometimes use Orchestrator to be able to augment application of SLOs in a much faster way. So that's something that you should keep in mind and read a little bit of checks on documentation on that, is that keep your SLOs to a minimum. Not saying you can't have SLOs. Certainly most organizations need SLOs. They're very valuable. But limit them to what you're actually using. Don't just create them to create them. Minimize the group calculation interval. By default, it's 30 seconds. If you have a lot of users, that's going to hammer the system. Change it to something much more reasonable, like 10 minutes. Otherwise, you're going to have one running and the other one won't finish. So you have all sorts of group calculation intervals, and the system keeps getting slower and slower because they're all trying to run within the 30-second interval, and it can't keep up. How to find a problematic workflow. Who's tried out Travis's how to find a problematic workflow stuff? Okay, I'm going to demo a little bit of that. It's really useful. Also, setting a watermark. What does that mean? I'll show you. Let's dive into it. All right, so in my environment, I have a server here. Where is this? There we go. So Travis Wright, if you Google like workflow performance issues, or you go out to the System Center Engineering blog, you're going to see that he released a kind of zip file on the gallery that lets you query the active status of the watermark of a particular workflow. So that's what this script is. Okay, so when you download it, you basically get these 3 scripts. All right, subscription status is in there. That's the one I'm using. Cut and paste it into here, into your query designer, and execute. Now, note that I have the display name of the actual workflow itself, the current watermark, and then the transaction log watermark, okay? So what does this mean? This means I am identical. I'm keeping up to date, right? If my system can't perform properly, what I'm going to see is that my watermark is going to be substantially behind the transaction watermark. So what I'm going to see is that my system isn't able to run through all the transactions that happened, and it's going to keep falling further and further behind, and my workflows are going to look like they're not executing. But in reality, they're executing, they're just way behind. There's a couple of reasons for that. Sometimes the batch size is too small for the number of things that are happening, and I'll show you how to adjust that. So there's a lot of ways to fix it. So when I show you how to change subscription status, don't just go start changing subscription statuses, because basically what that means is you're just saying don't run the workflow for these things. So that's helpful, but it's not what we're actually trying to do. We want to fix the workflow, right? I was looking at an environment once. We noticed that I think I did a blog on this. Basically, all the workflow service was crashing basically 2 minutes after it started. And what we found is that one workflow was 2 million behind, and it was crashing because there was something wrong with it. So in that particular case, we just nuked the workflow because it was useless to us. But in a lot of these cases, it's very important. So we need to figure out why it's not working. How do you actually go and how do you change the watermark? Very simple. So right here is the rule ID. This is a relationship-driven thing. So we have a rule ID in here. Note also at the bottom, there's a where clause that's filtering this. So this is actually filtering out a lot of the out-of-box ones, which is very helpful because I don't want it to do like the maintenance tasks. I wouldn't want to disable those. But note that there's this rule ID. Once you find a particular rule that is your problematic workflow, I can run the second command, which is update subscription watermark, which basically goes right here. You take the rule ID, put it right there, and you can execute it here, which is going to change the watermark for all of the rules matching that rule ID to the current number. Doesn't disable it, just change it to the current number. So if you had something that's hopelessly behind, but you still want to use it, and you know what it does, and you don't care for it to run on like all million objects you have in your CMDB, you just want to get it done and then use it going forward, you can change your subscription, you can basically artificially change the watermark. So something to know about how it works, why it works. Don't change the watermark on things that you don't know what they do. That's very important. All right. Jump back over here. All right. What we've found at scale is that using Orchestrator is the best place to do complex workflows, such as incident categorization, routing, notifications, and so on. Why is that? Because in many cases, you have these service manager administrators making 40 individual one-line workflows for category mappings to support groups or routing or assigned to relationships and so on. And service manager then has to bust through all those every time an incident comes in on a new incident, right? So that doesn't perform very well. It's just not an efficient way of doing it because you're running each of those. So what we want to do instead is we can use Orchestrator. So Orchestrator allows us to create very complex structures and also very visible structures that we can do in our system to be able to optimize, show my users how my incidents flow, but also route them in a really cool and fast way. So you can see in my particular scenario here, and I won't demo this, but I'll just kind of walk through it. I'm using a monitor activity. There's actually two different types of activities you could use here. You could use a monitor activity, or you could use a check schedule with a get command. Okay? So both of those are very valuable. Monitor activities are very simple to use. They're not very useful at going back in time, like if it hasn't been running and you want to check the old ones, but it's very simple. So in this particular case, I'm getting the source of the incident, and then based upon the title of the incident, I'm doing some routing. Note that I have, in both these cases, map user support group. That's a complex combination. So inside map user support group, in this particular instance, it's actually it's like 100 lines of mappings. So it's very simple to be able to build it out, and it's all in one workflow and easy to modify, and I can change control it. I can even put map user support group in its own runbook. If you use this style, you'll drastically improve workflow processing because you'll reduce your number of workflows by a substantial amount, and you'll see this each time it runs, and it'll be easy to show people because you can say, look, when my When my workflow comes in, I get the source of the workflow, and if it came in through a particular type, I then check for the title, and if it was the president of the company, I update the incident in one way, and if it's not the president of the company, then I map it to the support group. So it allows me to do some really cool things without having to have not having to have this sort of straight line mechanism. It's also easy for people to do versus kind of opening the authoring tool, making modifications there, then going and importing a management pack into Service Manager. That style is a little bit more challenging for people than using Orchestrator. So I feel that this is really the right place for them to be. We found this is also a great unit of scale because I can basically deploy an Orchestrator environment that does nothing but incident routing. And I can hammer that thing, right? And it doesn't have any impact on Service Manager. So I have a lot of great ways there to be able to segment my performance onto separate systems and keep my performance of getting incidents and writing incidents really fast. Also, you can use it with notifications. So when you're doing these operations like incident routing, you don't need to have a separate subscription in Service Manager. You can very easily get the user's target notification endpoint and email them right from Orchestrator. And it'll work just fine because they can reply to it and goes right into the Exchange connector. So I found that to be a really nifty way to be able to do it. Now note that the notification endpoint is not a retrievable class using the Orchestrator get object. So you do need to use the PowerShell commandlets to be able to return that. So I have a blog on it, so you can go kind of check that out if you want. And that's how you can go about getting that notification endpoint. If it matches the UPN, then you're simple. Like most companies, it matches the UPN, and you don't need to do that. Some it doesn't. All right, runbook initiation. This is really interesting. Runbook initiation basically is like, everybody knows that when you connect Orchestrator, you synchronize the Orchestrator connector, in comes the runbook, you create the template gets added to the other template of the service request, so when you submit this service request, Service Manager sees that it's got a runbook and it goes and kicks it off. And that works pretty good, right? In environments that are running a lot of workflows, that can perform a little bit slower than some other initiation styles. So basically what that has to do is it has to go, there's many like flips between new and in progress that have to happen there for that to run. So what we found is that when we switched to using Orchestrator to find new runbooks versus using the out-of-box orchestration initiation, and in this case we're running, I've used this style maybe 20 times now, so this style is usually only used in very high capacity environments or environments that have lots of workflows happening, lots of runbooks. So in this particular case, what we're doing is we're basically using Orchestrator to get runbook initiation activities that are ready to run. So in that particular case, we found that we were drastically improving our performance, about 4 times faster. When we flipped from one style to the other, we were running about 4 times as fast to be able to initiate a new runbook. So it's something to keep in mind. If you notice that your submit new service request that has an automation activity in it is running slowly, first, determine if you have a workflow problem and fix it. If your workflow problems are fine, and you simply want to say, hey, I want to just offload this operation, that's another style of doing it. If you want to see how that works, all you have to do is go back to how they ran it back in Service Manager 2010 when Orchestrator was integrating with it, because that's how they did it. They didn't have the initiator thing like they do now. So something to keep in mind. It made a big difference for us. All right, I already showed that. Now, let's talk about connectors. A couple aspects of connectors are very important. First, connectors generically have a somewhat disproportionate impact on the system, so we need to be very aware of how they work and where they work. So the first thing I can tell you is make sure you constrain what you bring over and set your constraints on initial configuration. So do you need all the groups? Do you need all the configuration items? Do you need every user? Do you need every computer? Do you need printers? Do you need computers from Active Directory? Probably not, because you're syncing from SCCM. Constrain your synchronization to what you need. Also, configure it in set increments, like configure 1 to bring over users, configure another to bring over groups. Why? Because you can segment when they run and how they run. Once you've configured a connector, you can't change it. So make sure you configure them the way you want. Test in your development environment how long it takes to synchronize before you go live so you can make those adjustments. Also, null is bad. Go in your connectors, look to see if you've checked do not sync null values. If you have sync null values checked, what will happen is your connectors will fight with each other. So let me give you an example. Active Directory synchronizes the Active Directory site of a user. SCCM doesn't have it. So SCCM sets that site value back to null. Active Directory sync sets it back to the site again. they just keep fighting with each other, right? So make sure they don't sync null connectors, or you'll have performance problems when they run, particularly because you're writing more data than you should. So be very aware of that. And you probably have null unchecked, so go check that. And also note that when you're synchronizing notification endpoints, that's probably the most performance impacting aspect of the entire synchronization. So there's going to be a couple adjustments to how that functions coming.
What if you got AD syncing like NetBio saying, and then SigManager syncing FQDN, they keep flip-flopping chains back and forth? How do you fix that? The way to do that?
So you're saying they have different information regarding the NetBIOS name and the FQDN? Yeah, let's talk after, because that seems more like a configuration problem than it does a should be environment. So yeah, let's talk about that. All right, also, DCM synchronization. DCM is a really problematic aspect of SCCM synchronization in Service Manager at scale, because you'll notice that the batch size of this synchronization is about 20. All right, so let's pretend that you have 10,000 or 20,000 DCM problematic systems synchronizing at any given point, and you have a workflow kicking off against them. That will drastically slow down the SCCM sync and drastically slow down the performance of the system. All right, so there's two things you do to fix this. First, you need to you need to disable the DCM workflow. That's really important. Disable it. Probably not going to use it. B, change the batch size. I'll show you how to do that. There's a DNS trick with Active Directory. Basically, if you're talking to a different Active Directory server, it does a lot more resync because it looks at the USN ID of the Active Directory server. So you want to try to get your connectors to always look at the same Active Directory target server, so it can use the actual kind of milestone that it had when it did the last synchronization. So basically you can use DNS to point it to there, or they're going to fix it in an upcoming pack. And then also sync custom variables, and that might be an answer for this gentleman's problem too. We can talk about it. Is you can synchronize custom variables in different ways. So what we found is that sometimes people want variables synchronized faster, more often, or they're not even in the basic sync, right? So a colleague of mine, Christopher Mank, he's just a rocket scientist with development around Service Manager. He wrote a blog on how to synchronize, just really basic, easy to follow blog, nothing complex, on how to synchronize a custom property over to Service Manager using Orchestrator as the mechanism, but using the CSV connector to bring it in. So take a look at that. That's very valuable. We found that concept's been very useful, although we've altered it in much more complex ways. Connector scheduling. I found that obviously scheduling connectors is very important, and scheduling connectors facilitates us actually having a performing system. So there's two ways to do that. You can modify it in PowerShell, and you can modify it in the XML. Those are both very simple to do. I didn't put a link in there, but if you Bing it, if you find the kind of Bing scheduling SCSM connectors, that's something that's very straightforward. Also, you can use Orchestrator to turn on and off the jobs. We've actually sided toward the Orchestrator approach in certain instances because we feel like it gives us a little bit more control. So that's something to be aware of. Note that if you disable a job, it will not stop running until the synchronization is done. Just because you stopped the job or disabled the workflow and restarted the service over and over, it's not going to stop running. Be aware of that. It's just, there's nothing you can do about how that runs at this particular point. Batch size, how do we change it? So, number one rule is never show XML in a slide. I'm doing just that. But you can note that in our particular organization here, I've bolded some areas of it right here. It's polling interval and batch size. Why is the batch size important? The batch size basically says how many items can I process inside the context of one workflow. The DCM workflow is by default set very small. You can change these things, and this allows us to make modifications. Sometimes you need to use overrides to disable or enable certain workflows. Something else to keep in the back of your mind. When you use overrides, it goes to a separate table. Note that because when you're looking at that table I showed in the tool and it returns which ones are enabled or not, if you use an override, it still has rule enabled, but the override is actually in a different table. So just you should be aware of that if you're troubleshooting your workflows and you used an override to fix it. Tweaking batch size is very important. It allows us to fix quite a few things, so something to keep in mind. Related orchestrator tips. First, use a dedicated SQL server for Orchestrator. Don't put it on the SQL server that you use for Service Manager. Why? Because it's a lot easier to scale segmented pieces of this environment than it is to scale one gigantic SQL server, because they're competing for resources. So we found that Orchestrator, putting its SQL server on fast disk, and allowing it to have dedicated runbook servers, allows us to have a drastic performance difference of the runbook execution. Also, we talked about having a targeted Service Manager server. And then note that SQL servers for this particular implementation will be disk bound. So make sure that you have great performing disk. We've had instances where it's been on the wrong disk and that's had performance impacts. Very, very, very important. A lot of people like to enable logging when they're doing runbook design. You'll notice a drastic performance difference in a runbook that's using logging, particularly activity-specific logging, than one that has it disabled. So note that you should have activity-specific logging disabled on your runbooks. We noticed that somewhere between a sort of 5-to-1 and 3-to-1 ratio of runbook execution times tied to logging versus not logging. And also, if we had logging enabled and we're hammering our management server, we'll notice that then the management server doesn't perform properly. So when you go into Runbook Designer, you can't get basically you can't return the runbooks. Really bad search scenario. So make sure that you don't use activity-specific logging in production. Use it in your dev environment all you want. Maybe use it for testing, but don't use it in production. Use runbook execution servers, and also clear your logs. What does this mean? So the out-of-box clear application in Orchestrator doesn't work all that great. So if it's over, say, like 500 logs in the log table, the out-of-box log clearing mechanism tends to fail because it runs too long. And also, when it runs, it causes a ridiculous performance impact on Orchestrator, practically stopping it. So very bad. So we blogged on how to manually clear Orchestrator logs. I'll show you how to do that because I've used it probably no less than 100 times. So something very important to know, if you have more than 10,000 logs in your Orchestrator list, in your Orchestrator tables, you will not be able to use the out-of-box purge. It will fail, and trying to clear them with the out-of-box capabilities will not work. So you need to use something like this. So I'll show you how to do that. I'll also note that when your logs are when you have lots of logs, everything else slows down. So when you go into the Runbook Designer, note that you'll see the logs from when you started using it to now. So when you go to that page, it's going to return them all. So that's another reason why when you're in Runbook Designer, and you're using a runbook that has, say, 30 gig of logs associated with it, because you forgot to turn off activity-specific logging, this allows you to change that very easily. Beware of the licensing issue. Before Service Pack 1, there was a little bug that if your servers couldn't connect to your SQL server that was running the Orchestrator database, they would all of a sudden believe that they're unlicensed. So that was fixed in Service Pack 1, so something to be aware of. And then also be aware that don't configure your transaction logs improperly. Make sure it's not set to full, set it to simple, and make sure it has the space to expand if it needs to. All right, let's change this. I'm going to show you how to clear these logs. Very easy, but I just want to show you what we do. So you note that I'm on my Orchestrator server. Here's my Orchestrator database. It's got some tables in it. I have 4 basic commands. Delete from policy instances. I'm using that because the policy instances table has relationships to other tables. So if I use truncate, I just clear the log directory, I just clear the log table, it won't work. It'll fail because it has relationships. So if you use delete, it runs properly. Truncate table, object instances, and events. If you don't want to clear your events, basically in Orchestrator, events is started, stopped, couldn't connect. It's all the error logging associated with Orchestrator itself. These are the error logging and basic information logging associated with the runbook execution. Right? So you can break those in half. This is runbook execution. This is like your event log for Orchestrator. If you clear this, they're gone. So note that, right? Back up your database ahead of time. This will run against 30 gigabytes of logs in 5 seconds. Obviously, because it's just doing a delete. But when you're stuck and you can't run, so I just deleted 24 rows of logs, right? So if you're stuck and you can't use the out-of-box log purge, and your log file is 24 gigs, this is going to be your savior. So put that in the back of your mind and make sure you know where to find it or how to run it. All right. We can also schedule that too, by the way. And you can do a little bit more complexities there. All right, data warehouse. Data warehouse is a very interesting bird because its job is to synchronize the data over, transform it, insert it into the tables, and what we found is that it's a little finicky. But it's also very good at keeping lots of data, right? So if you're good at operations manager data warehousing, you're going to be good at service manager data warehousing because they're the same kind of structure. So when you look at the data warehouse, again, use a dedicated SQL server. Understand the analysis impact. You can offload analysis services. So be aware of that. That's something you can take off. Cube processing is unlike your basic OLTP processing, right? Cube processing is CPU-centric, also is RAM-centric. So when you're doing cube processing, when you're doing transforms, you're going to start to see CPU actually hit hard there. So throwing more CPUs at it on the data warehouse is probably going to help you. Also, throwing more RAM at it is going to ridiculously help you. So if your cubes aren't processing in time, throwing a bunch of RAM at it is probably going to help you. Also, if your disk doesn't perform well, you're going to have similar kinds of issues. So these kinds of things are really important. We've also found that for some instances, we have some really good report writers, and what we've done is we've done snapshotting. So we've snapshotted, for example, our CMDB, and used that to provide some information back as well in lieu of our data warehouse. So that's another option you can take advantage of, and that's allowed us to deliver some really cool stuff from the CMDB without having to wait for the transforms to happen, and allowing us to use data that isn't brought over the data warehouse. Sometimes you don't want all your data in the data warehouse, but we can perform a snapshot against the CMDB, tied to the report server that's on the data warehouse, and use that to return information as well. So both of those approaches are very helpful. Obviously, the data warehouse is something that we use over a long period of time, so we're going to have many, many years of data there. Something that you should know about and something that you should check. This is very important. Batch size of your transform. We found that in large environments, sometimes the batch size of 50,000 is too small. So we need to adjust it so it can run through the items faster in one job. So you'll note right down here where there's this little bold 100,000. You can change that to whatever it is that you want, but note that the batch size of out of box may be too small if you haven't been running your transforms for a while, right? So you need to be aware of how that works and whether or not it's impacting you. Usually it's very easy to see what is run and what hasn't run because you can go to your tab that's running your transforms. If you don't know how the transform process works, Travis did a really, really good session last year at TechEd on reporting services on the data warehouse that you should watch. And there's also some posted online regarding the transform process. If you understand how the data gets to the data warehouse, then your batch size is going to make a ton of sense, right? Obviously, makes sense anyway, but it's understanding how it works is going to be helpful in fixing it. There's also a restart process. If you haven't run them in a while, you can run them on a sequential basis, and that will allow for you to be able to execute all the transform jobs very, very quickly, or at least in the correct orders. Also note that when you're synchronizing new values to the data warehouse, that's going to have a potentially significant impact on the transform. So if you've added an extended management packs that contain new data or contain data that's already in the data warehouse, that's important, and it will take a while to run. Finally, note that if you have added a sealed management pack that contains a new field, and then you rebuilt your data warehouse, and before you rebuilt your data warehouse, you had inserted data into the tables that were in that new management pack. Basically, you wrote to those fields before the data warehouse was functioning. That data likely won't show up in the data warehouse. So order of events does matter in the data warehouse. So before you start writing data to new fields, make sure those fields have made their way over the data warehouse so it synchronizes. If it hasn't, it'll only synchronize new stuff. That's problematic because data warehouse's job is to be consistent information that provides us with long-term reporting. What happens if I don't have all the information regarding my CIs for the new field I just added and populated? That's bad. So you need to make sure that that gets over there, and that's particularly related to performance. All right, cool. So we've got about 9 minutes left for some questions. So I'm going to go to my little question deck here. All right, cool. So I'll let people walk up for questions, and I'll start to address some of these. Awesome, great. All right, what's the number one performance issue that you see? Number one performance issue that I see is related to disk I/O. So if you're having disk I/O issues, that's going to negatively impact every aspect of the system. So that's something that SQL I/O application is going to really help you with. So something obviously to watch out for. Awesome. Thanks. All right, anybody else have a question? You go up to the mics.
So getting back to the question about the connectors, if you have a potentially or poorly configured connector, what are your options? You basically have to remove it and add it back again? Because you said they couldn't be edited once they were set up.
Yeah, that's really problematic, and I totally agree with you. Basically what happens is once you've added a connector, the question was once you've added a connector, you can't modify it. So once you've added a connector, you can't just go into the configuration and make a change to it. You actually have to create a new connector, resynchronize the data, and that will flip. They'll actually add an additional digit to the connector, to the object that was synchronized, indicating the connector that brought it over. So on every item that's synchronized by a connector, there's indication of what connector brought it. So if you delete the connector that brought it over, and there's only one connector that brought it over, it's gone. If you synchronize it with another connector, you therefore will then be able to delete the initial one. I'm not that brave. I usually disable the original connector because I don't want to lose what I had.
So in other words, if you remove a connector, all the CIs that came in through that go with it?
Absolutely. If not, that's an important point in two ways. If you delete the connector, all the CIs go away. Also, if you delete a management pack that has a sealed item in it, all the data goes away. So let's say I add a new field to all my Active Directory users, and I populated it, and then someone says, oh, I'm going to deploy a new version of this management pack. Let's just delete the existing one and put a new one in there. That's going to blow away that field from, basically drops the table, right? So all that data is gone. So you should constrain who's allowed to deploy new management packs and delete existing management packs to people who know what they're doing, not people who are just kind of messing around. What other questions do you guys have?
Real quick one on the SQL Server.
Yeah.
I've heard differing stories about how to host those databases. We actually were working with a consultant at one point that actually had us put them all on one master SQL server. And I wanted to know if that could be affecting our speed. They're all on one. Like, we literally have them all SQL databases are running on one server.
Yeah. Unless you're a smallish organization, I wouldn't do that. Smaller organizations, no big deal, right? I mean, it doesn't matter. I can put it all in one box, and I'll probably be able to perform fine.
Yeah, we have about 3,500 users.
Yeah. So in that size, it makes more sense to segment it because, A, you're much better able to scale smaller segmented resources than you are one gigantic resource. And I found that very practically, that when I'm able to segment what I deliver through either different SQL servers or SQL servers that can scale on their own, or I can put them on different sets of disks, I just give myself options. Like my dad always used to tell me, like, make sure you've got your options. He meant my wallet. Make sure you got your options when you go out. Like, I don't want to lock myself in, right? I want to give myself options. So if I break it out into different sets, if it's a bigger environment, I give myself options to scale. Otherwise, I'm locked into whatever that thing can do and wherever it's sitting. So unless you have just a rock star SQL team that knows what they're doing, I would segment.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you show us a system where you have implemented the performance optimizations, for example, for the console performance at all?
Yeah. Check this out. One, two, three. That's pretty cool, huh? So if you wanted to perform like that, then you make some of the changes that we walked through.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Could you go into more about the implied permissions and what you lose by disabling that? Because we're running into that with our AD connector and performance.
You're running into the implied permissions issue?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would turn it, frankly, I would turn it off, and I would use direct permissions. Make them operators, even scoped operators. It's going to be better than the implied permissions rule.
Okay.
That's what I would do.
Okay.
You are advised to disconnect the desired configuration connector, desired configuration manager connector for the desired. But we are trying to implement it. Do you have an alternative? Do you use other things instead of disable this workflow? Or because you disable, but what's happening if we would like to enable that functionality?
For desired configuration management?
Yeah.
Okay. So desired configuration management does work fine at smaller batch sets, and won't have a negative impact to smaller batch sets. Where we ran into is where people have very, very large batch sets, where they're using it to determine client health, and they've got over 10,000 systems. That's where we start to really run into some performance problems with it. If you change the batch size, that will help make it perform much better, because instead of running in when you go in the event log and you see all these subscription issues, that's oftentimes because you have so many items, each of those are trying to process a smaller batch, and you've got the workflow engine running thousands and thousands of workflows trying to execute at the same time as the incident workflows that move it from new to in progress, right? Okay. So are new to active. So if you change the batch size, that will help. Otherwise, I would disable that workflow altogether. Okay. Does that help you? Awesome, cool. Go ahead. Yes, yes. Let me see if I can show you an example of that. Yes, it's basically what we're doing is we're using this is the way I do it. I use a get schedule and a get object versus a monitor object. But a monitor object would work too, because you could do an on update new or on update in progress would work. But in some cases, we disabled all those process workflows where it goes from new, because think about it, like new service request comes in. It goes to new, in progress. The activities go new, in progress. So you have 4 workflows that had to run. Then there's the workflow that runs to initiate the orchestrator process. And then in order for it to know it's completed, it had to check to see if it was completed and then change it again and then change it again. So there's like 10 workflows that got to run for that to happen. If you just do it on new, your execution is going to be like that. And it's so much more consistent. So your mileage may vary. What I should probably do is blog on it, because it will help to make it a little bit more simple for people to follow. But also, if you wanted to check it out, if you look back at how they used Opalis with Service Manager 2010, same process. It's basically identical. But it's really only necessary in larger environments, or high capacity. Not really necessary in like a smallish environment. Like less than 10,000 users, you probably don't require it. But over that, you're probably going to want to. Go ahead. Yeah, the question was, in organizations that have a 32-bit console, how do I improve their performance? And that's absolutely a good thing to note, because we've seen the same thing. And there's 2 ways we've solved it. And you may not like it, but the 2 ways that we've chosen to solve it is either through implementing remote app in conjunction with a delivery mechanism to them. You should know the remote app option doesn't work well with a virtualized server, because the console performance on a virtualized server is terrible. It's like 10 seconds to open up an incident. So we found that non-virtualized servers or servers running remote effects run a lot faster. Now, you could also use the Grid Pro or Saracen stuff, and that's a lot better for those users as well. The Grid Pro ones mirror the console experience, so there's no training required. And the Saracen ones are HTML5, so they're easy to use too. So there are different benefits of both, but I would check those out too if you're trying to serve those users. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Have you come across a situation where the DCM, the amount of data coming from DCM and Config Manager, it doesn't seem to be reporting quite correctly when it's to do with FEP baseline reporting information to do with compliance? Because in our environment, we've noticed that it's reporting the incorrect way. So we're getting thousands, 50,000 plus sort of records coming per each compliance report from DCM. I wonder if you've seen that experience anywhere else?
So you're saying that, I kind of caught parts of that. So the DCM synchronization is not accurately synchronizing to the Service Manager?
Yeah, because the data that's pulling out from within SCCM, it's the actual baseline information in SCCM is coming back with the wrong information. As far as we're aware, in our environment, we've just installed it as per default for FEP baselines, and as a result, pulling back millions of records sort of thing on us. So it's slowing down our synchronization.
Gotcha.
I just wanted to see if this is a common sort of thing that other people are going through as well.
Most of the issues with DCM synchronization have been related to performance of that synchronization, not related to consistency.
Okay.
So you can ping me offline, or we can talk about it further after this, and we can dig into it a little bit more. No problem with that.
Yeah, that's cool.
But the problems I've seen have been performance related, not necessarily consistency related.
Cool.
Any other questions? Awesome. So we are just about out of time. So I will thank you for coming. I appreciate it. And if you have any other questions afterward, I'll hang around and we can answer them.